Hey guys, I know that we are in a little bit of uncharted territory here with the setup that we've got moving forward. Originally, the plan had always been to cover this content with you in class, just very quickly, but given the circumstances, I'm just gonna do a very quick overview on this because it really wasn't gonna take more than 10 minutes at most when we were in class with one another. So rather than doing it in the typical video setup, I'm just going to do a voiceover, move you through it, and then we will move on. A lot of this ties into some of the content that you completed when you were doing the antisocial relations notes, particularly with prejudice, discrimination. But it also is important to recognize this comes back to much of what we discussed in Unit 7 with the idea of concepts, cognitive processes, how it is that we perceive ourselves. So that'll even go into Unit 10. So that's just another reason why this is going to be a bit of a shorter video, simply just because it connects back to a lot of what we've already done. So what I'm going to ask you to do is at the top of the little handout you've got, I want you to essentially answer these questions on your paper. Okay, put them in the space that's provided to you. When we look at the concept of self-concept, remember that it's your sense of identity and personal worth. So when we boiled it down to a very simplistic understanding with one another in earlier units, we basically just said it's all the thoughts that we have about ourselves when we are asked to address the question of who am I? Okay. The next thing you're asked to do on here is to describe your self-concept. So how do you feel about yourself? What are your thoughts about yourself, your personal worth, your identity? Everybody's going to have a little bit of a different answer to this. Some of you guys are going to focus more so on your roles. That you are a student, you are a child, you're a sibling, you are a friend, et cetera, et cetera. Some of you guys are going to focus on other aspects, particularly your self-worth. So that you deserve to have good things happen to you, that you're a good person, that you're caring, that you're kind, things along those lines. So everybody's is going to be slightly different when it comes to their description of their self-concept. But it's important to recognize that in many respects, external factors, especially like our culture, race, ethnicity, gender, even your socioeconomic status can impact your self-concept. And that's a really important thing to recognize too, as we move through some of this significance for cultural norm and the impact on sense of self. If we're talking about social psychology, it's important to recognize that the norms within a culture, so what a society deems to be acceptable behavior, is then going to influence how it is that you see yourselves. You see this in particular when it comes to aspects of social media. That's one of the greatest reasons why social media has such a negative perception of it. Because all you're really ever seeing is somebody's highlight reel. You're seeing what they want you to see about their life and how good it is, okay? Or how they have the latest style that's out there, or insert whatever it is that you want to put in there as an example or an application for it. And so you end up as a result comparing yourself to the others that you see when it comes to their how many likes they get to their TikTok video versus how many you got to your last video, how many followers you've got, how things along those lines. All of those are us comparing ourselves to others, because that's deemed to be kind of the norm now. How self-concept can vary between individualistic versus collective cultures is certainly something to keep in mind too, based off of the norms within those societies. If you go back to when we learned about these concepts, individualistic societies like ours are very much going to influence the way that you behave. You're seeing this an awful lot currently with the coronavirus outbreak. There's a lot of, because Western cultures are more individualized, there's a lot of failure of recognizing how your individual actions can ultimately end up influencing the society as a whole when it comes to trying to prevent the spread of this epidemic. And so you're seeing younger and younger people not necessarily following along with the safe social distancing practices or things along those lines because they are operating under an assumption that the disease isn't as impactful to them. However, research is showing that in many respects, up to a third of the cases that involve people being hospitalized and put on ventilators and respiratory aids, it is from people of younger generations. So the disease isn't exactly discriminating when it comes to those circumstances. Collectivist cultures, when you look at traditionally Asian cultures, like for example, Korea or Japan, um, they worked very hard to be able to contain the spread of that virus. And because there is more of an emphasis on the whole or the group or the family, you're seeing far less um, of a push to, go against the rules and the expectations that are outlined with social distancing. So now let's talk about just very quickly some of the research that underlines the significance of culture and societal expectations on a person's self-concept development. Most landmark case that we're going to look to is the Clark doll test. So Kenneth Clark and his wife Mamie, they did this research back in I believe it was in 1939, actually, and then they did some replications of it in the 1940s as well. Um, but what they wanted to do was look at the impact that uh, prejudice, discrimination, and segregation processes could have on the development of self-concept for African American kids. And it turned out that their findings within this research ended up having significant influence on the Supreme Court's decision in the Brown versus Board of Education case to end up desegregating American schools. So let's talk about what they did. Ultimately, what Mimi and Kenneth Clark did was they took African American children and they made a very simplistic experiment. They simply just asked them, put two different dolls in front of them. They were virtually identical. The only thing that was different about them was their skin color. So there was a white doll and there was a black doll. And they asked the African American children which doll they preferred. And overwhelmingly, the African American kids picked the white doll. They perceived it as prettier and nicer. And so it was from that research that the conclusion of the significance of prejudice and discriminatory processes and segregation, what that could have on the development of an African American child's self-concept. Because of that, and those policies, they felt inferiority and even self-hatred because of the color of their skin and how society had treated them because of the color of their skin. So I think that becomes pretty clear then when we look at this question here, how race and ethnicity could impact one's self-concept of what the answer happens to be for that. Now, we're going to skip past that because that was an in-class activity that we don't need to do for these purposes. I'm just going to tackle two more pieces for you quickly, and then we're going to get you on your way. How can some things influence self-concept when it comes to some of these more cognitive processes? Because it's not enough to simply just say that culture influences self-concept. Concept is a cognitive process, so there has to be other things that influence it cognitively speaking. So one is something called mirror image perception. Okay, so essentially what this is exactly as the word describes it to be. When you have two opposing groups or conflicting groups, each side seems to hold the belief as seeing itself as ethical and peaceful, and that the other side is more aggressive. And you can certainly look to scenarios of in-group versus out-group biases to explain how it is that these kinds of perceptions can develop from this kind of ideology. But it can very much contribute to circumstances of the other race effect. Okay, and this was one of your terms that you read about in your textbook with the antisocial relations as well. it's a very strong contributing factor to stereotypical and prejudicial thought processes. White people have shown to have difficulty distinguishing differentiations amongst people of other races. So, not trying to perpetuate stereotypes here, but just elaborating on the concept. Um, they feel that it is very hard to distinguish physical characteristics of one African American to another, or one Asian to another. So, for example, within Asian cultures, you have Korean, you have Vietnamese, you have Chinese, you have Japanese. It's very common for you to hear stereotypes of people that are white being unable to differentiate between someone who is of Korean descent versus someone who is of Vietnamese descent. And that can apply vice versa. It can be a challenge for those who are of Asian descent, for example, to be capable of distinguishing differentiation between Caucasians, between whites. And so that can be kind of hard to those of white descent to follow because in their mind, whites have different hair colors, different eye color, but they're coming at it from their own personal point of view within the realm of their own race. How mirror image perception can influence things is simply just because when you perceive the other side as being the aggressor and that you are the peaceful one, ultimately that can lend itself toward breeding or continuing conflict. So, to do a very West Side example here, let's say, it's Elder versus Oak Hills. Okay. We all know about how everybody feels the need to spray paint that guardrail there on the hairpin turns at Ebenezer. And so, for the longest period of time, there has been this constant go back between Oak Hills kids and Elder kids when it comes to that stuff because we perceive them as being the ones that like instigate things and they start things and they're the aggressor. And then so we just, respond and vice versa. They hold the same belief. And so it's very hard to break those cycles then when everybody perceives themselves as being the peaceful one and the other side being the aggressor. Finally, you've got self-fulfilling prophecy. This is something we have covered multiple times in here. It's the belief that leads to its own fulfillment. Okay, now obviously you're going to want to make sure that you have some kind of synonymous term that you input there for yourself moving forward when we tackle FRQs. But you've heard me give this numerous times in class. What you believe to be true will become true simply just because you believe it. So if Susan believes she won't pass the next AP Psych test or exam, let's say she believes that she will not pass the AP test coming down the pike. So she doesn't study for the test very hard because she perceives she will fail anyway. And then once the failure occurs, it confirms the belief that she had that she wasn't ever going to pass it in the first place. So because her prophecy ended up being fulfilled, she continues to hold that cycle, moving into other circumstances. So for example, when she moves on to college, she's going to sit there and say, well, I didn't perform well in high school, so therefore I'm not going to do very well in this class, so I'm just not going to try terribly hard. Okay. We hold that belief even though our actions truly could alter the prophecy. Okay, and so we've talked in the past about how learned helplessness, for example, can facilitate the development of self-fulfilling prophecy, even though action truly can have an impact, particularly if you have internal locus of control. Okay, so hopefully this wasn't too terribly confusing. Y'all know I have a tendency to get real wordy and talk a little longer than I intend, inevitably. So my apologies for going about 3 minutes over this originally assigned time frame. Obviously, if you got any questions, let me know, because I know that this is not an ideal set of circumstances that we find ourselves in, but I'm always here to help if you need it.